What if time is not a straight line, but a room we sometimes forget how to leave? Most of us live as if tomorrow is guaranteed. We wake, move forward, make choices, and trust that the clock will carry us along without hesitation. Time, in this familiar sense, feels obedient. It progresses. It forgives. It rarely asks anything of us beyond participation. But every so often, a question slips through the cracks of that certainty. A moment repeats. A conversation feels rehearsed. A scene arrives with the strange weight of memory, even when we are certain it has never happened before. We call it déjà vu and move on, reassured by science and habit. The feeling fades, and the day continues. Yet what if, for a few people, the feeling did not fade? This story begins in ordinary places. A commuter train rattling toward the city. A hospital corridor lit by fluorescent bulbs at 2 a.m. A classroom where the clock ticks louder than the students' thoughts. A wedding morning heavy with perfume, nerves, and sunlight. These are not the settings of fantasy. They are the unnoticed backdrops of daily life. And in these places, something quietly broke its pattern. For reasons no one can explain, a small number of people found themselves living the same stretch of time again. Not remembering it afterward, not dreaming it, but fully experiencing it, awake and aware, while the world around them remained oblivious. The same words spoken, the same accidents unfolding, the same seconds returning to their starting point, like a needle dropped again and again onto the same groove of a record. At first, they doubted themselves. Exhaustion, stress, imagination, that is what we are taught to suspect when reality behaves strangely. But repetition has a way of eroding denial. When you know exactly when a glass will fall, or which stranger will cough, or the precise minute when something terrible will happen, doubt loses its authority. What makes these stories unsettling is not their strangeness, but their intimacy. Nothing cosmic announces itself. No sky opens. No voice explains the rules. The loop does not arrive with meaning attached. Meaning must be discovered, or not at all. Some people tried to escape by force. They broke routines, defied expectations, created chaos where order once lived. It did not help. The day reset anyway, indifferent to rebellion. Others withdrew, waiting for time to release them on its own. It didn't. Slowly, a pattern emerged, not of physics, but of attention. The repetition seemed to gather around something unresolved, a moment ignored, a life overlooked, a fear postponed. The loop behaved less like a punishment and more like a pause, as if time itself were asking a question and refusing to continue until it received an answer. This is not a story about time travel or paradoxes. It is not an argument against science. These experiences, whether real, psychological, or something stranger still, resist proof. Evidence disappears. Records contradict themselves. Memory becomes the only witness. But memory, as fragile as it is, carries weight. Each person who lived through a repeating moment was changed by it. Not because time broke, but because something inside them shifted. Compassion replaced distraction. Presence replaced fear. Choice replaced momentum. Perhaps time did not trap them at all. Perhaps it waited. As we move forward through these stories, one by one, consider this possibility, that the rarest gift is not more time, but the chance to notice what a moment is asking of us before it slips away. And if time ever were to stop for you, if a single hour refused to pass, what would it be trying to teach you? It started with a train. A gray Tuesday morning in London. Damp air clung to the windows. Commuters crowded into their routines. Among them, David Shaw, a quiet man in his early 40s, rode the same carriage to the city office he'd worked in for over a decade. He carried the same briefcase, wore the same charcoal suit, read the same paper. Life moved in familiar lines. But that Tuesday didn't end. Not really. At precisely 8:47 a.m., the woman in the red coat spilled her coffee. The man with the briefcase dropped his newspaper. At 8:52, the conductor's voice echoed through the train. "Delays ahead. Thank you for your patience." These were not just patterns, they were repetitions. The exact same moments, word for word, gesture for gesture. The first time it repeated, David chalked it up to a strange sense of déjà vu. The second time, he was unnerved. By the fifth, he was afraid. Each morning, he awoke to the same sound of his alarm at 6:30 a.m., his wife still half asleep beside him, unaware. To her, it was always just one Tuesday. But David had lived it already, 6, then 7, then 8 times. He tried to resist the rhythm, missed the train, slept in, stayed home. It made no difference. Each new morning, the same Tuesday. A perfect reset. His journals grew thick with notes. He tried to alter outcomes. Spilled coffee, misplaced bags, spontaneous conversations, but the day clung tightly to its choreography. Then came the 15th loop. David noticed a homeless man near the platform. A face that had blurred into the background of his daily life now stared directly at him with recognition, a gaze that held too much awareness to dismiss. "How many times now?" the man asked, his voice low and rough. David froze. "You know," the man continued, "been through a few myself. Different days, different places. It breaks when you do the thing you're supposed to." David pressed him for answers, but there were none, only that cryptic guidance. The loop had a center, an event unresolved, a hinge. David spent the next loops scouring every detail. What had he missed? Then, on the 19th loop, he saw her, a teenage girl, earbuds in, standing too close to the platform's edge, eyes on her phone. Every loop she had been there, a detail in the corner of his perception. Until now. The realization hit him like cold water. She was going to fall. At 8:53 a.m., as the train thundered into the station, David rushed forward and pulled her back. She startled, furious, confused, but alive. That evening, David fell asleep expecting another Tuesday. Instead, his alarm rang on a Wednesday. The journals were gone. His wife remembered nothing unusual. But David knew. The familiarity of that Tuesday had dissolved into the unfamiliar quiet of a new day. And somewhere, a girl who didn't know she'd been saved lived on because of a moment that refused to pass unnoticed. Reflecting on it later, David didn't think of it as a supernatural punishment or a glitch in the world. It felt more like a chance, a second, third, 19th chance to see something that mattered more than his own routine. How many times, he wondered, had he passed by moments like that? How many lives had brushed against his without him noticing? The train moved on. The world moved on. But David had learned something vital. Sometimes time stops not to punish, but to wait, until we choose to pay attention to what matters most. At night, hospitals exist in a different dimension. The hallways grow quieter. The machines speak more loudly. Time feels stretched thin, pulled between urgency and exhaustion. It was during one of these nights that Dr. Emily Chen first noticed something was wrong. The ambulance arrived at 2:15 a.m. A young man, mid-20s, mangled by a high-speed collision. Internal bleeding, multiple fractures, the kind of case that demands focus without hope. Emily did everything right. She followed protocol, coordinated her team, moved with the practiced calm that years of trauma medicine had carved into her. At 3:47 a.m., the patient died. She stood still for a moment after calling the time of death. The room emptied. Another loss added to the quiet weight she carried home every night. Then she was back in the emergency bay. The clock read 2:15 a.m. The same stretcher rolled in. The same paramedics. the same injuries, the same man, alive again and slipping away. Emily assumed she was hallucinating. Fatigue can fracture perception. Grief can replay itself. But when the patient died again at exactly 3:47 a.m., something inside her went cold. By the third repetition, denial collapsed. She was not remembering. She was reliving. Each loop she tried something new. Faster transfusions, different surgical angles, earlier consultations. Each time the outcome was unchanged. The young man's body failed at the same minute, as if obeying an appointment neither medicine nor will could cancel. What unsettled her most was the isolation. Her colleagues moved through each iteration untouched, concerned only by her growing agitation. When she tried to explain, they exchanged looks meant for doctors, not believers. By the 7th loop, Emily questioned her own sanity. By the 10th, she stopped caring about explanations. All that mattered was the patient. On the 11th repetition, desperation stripped away routine. Instead of scanning the obvious injuries, she followed an intuition she couldn't explain. A wound that looked superficial, a detail dismissed too easily before. She explored deeper. There it was, a small arterial tear bleeding slowly into the chest cavity. Not dramatic, not immediate, just enough to kill him every time. She repaired it. 3:47 a.m. passed. The monitors kept humming. The patient lived. At 6 a.m., Emily sat alone in the locker room and cried, not from relief, but from the accumulated weight of 11 deaths no one else remembered. Time moved forward. The shift ended. The patient recovered. Years later, she learned he had become a paramedic. Inspired, he said, by the night doctors refused to give up on him. Emily never told him the truth, that she had watched him die again and again. That time had held her in place until she noticed what everyone, including herself, had overlooked. Looking back, she wondered whether the loop had been about skill at all, or whether it had been about attention, about listening closely enough to what didn't fit the pattern. In medicine, they say experience saves lives. But Emily had been given something stranger than experience. She had been given repetition without forgetting. And she carried with her a question she never voiced aloud. How many lives hinge on the details we dismiss because we are too tired, too rushed, too certain? Time had waited for her to see. Only then did it move on. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Sarah Mitchell woke to sunlight streaming through gauzy curtains, the smell of peonies in the air, and the gentle rustle of bridesmaids already bustling around the house. Her wedding day had arrived, the culmination of months of planning, years of dreaming, and a lifetime of imagining what this moment might feel like. The ceremony was perfect. Her husband's vows brought tears to everyone's eyes. The reception shimmered with laughter, clinking glasses and dancing. That night, Sarah fell asleep beside the man she loved, exhausted and elated. Then it was morning again, and somehow it was her wedding day, again. Same sunlight, same peonies, same messages on her phone, the same date. At first, she thought it was a vivid dream. Then she saw her wedding dress, perfectly arranged, just as before. She checked the clock, the text thread with her maid of honor. Everything was exactly the same. She went through the day once more, stunned but compliant, trying to make sense of it. Maybe this was stress. Maybe this was what they called a mental break. The next morning, she woke to the same day again. By the fourth time, she stopped telling anyone. What could she say? That she was getting married again to the same man who thought it was still his one and only wedding day? She started noticing the repetition's precision. The photographer's jokes landed on the same beats. The best man's toast fumbled in the exact same way. Even the wind carried the same scent. It was beautiful and unbearable. By the sixth loop, the beauty began to erode. Sarah was no longer nervous or thrilled. She was numb. She knew exactly when her father would cry. She could anticipate each clink of silverware. She tried changing her vows slightly. No one noticed. She skipped dances, changed table arrangements, even whispered to her husband about the loop. He only looked at her with concern. No one remembered. No one else was aware. On the 7th morning, she sat alone by her window before dressing. Tears welled in her eyes, not from joy, but from exhaustion. Would this be her life now, an endless replay of a perfect day that never became anything more? Then something shifted. She remembered her grandmother's necklace, her something old that she had forgotten to wear in every previous loop. It had been tucked away in a drawer for years. This time she found it. There was a note she hadn't seen before, handwritten in her grandmother's curling script. Wear this on your wedding day. Love is not about holding on to one perfect moment. It's about choosing each other again and again, through change, through time. Sarah placed the necklace around her neck. The day unfolded as before. Same ceremony, same vows, same kiss beneath the archway of flowers. But this time, it felt different, as if the moment had deepened. When they drove away from the reception, she felt something loosen in the air. The next morning, she awoke in the honeymoon suite. It was the day after. Her husband stirred beside her, unaware that she had married him 7 times before. He kissed her cheek and murmured, "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell." Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes. We finally made it. She never told him about the loops. She never told anyone. But for the rest of her life, she carried the quiet knowledge that even perfect days must pass, that love isn't forged in the ceremony, but in what comes after. Time had waited until she understood that a wedding is not the destination, but the beginning of something more real. Something that can only unfold when you're finally allowed to move forward. It was a Wednesday morning when Marcus Webb stood at the front of his 3rd period history class and began his lecture on World War II. A topic he'd taught dozens of times to dozens of different students in nearly identical classrooms. He was used to the rhythm. Start at 10:15 a.m., wrap by 11:05, 50 minutes measured in facts, dates, the occasional joke. But this class didn't end. Or rather, it ended, only to begin again. The first time he barely noticed. A sense of déjà vu when the girl in the 2nd row dropped her books. Again when the boy in the back made his predictable wisecrack at 10:31. Again when the same question was asked in the same tone at the same moment. By the 3rd iteration, Marcus stopped pretending he didn't notice. The clock betrayed him, 10:15 a.m. again. The same students filed in. The same bell rang. A loop had begun, and it showed no intention of ending. He tried changing the lesson, talked about Rome instead of Normandy. It didn't matter. The students responded with the same questions from the bubble-waboo lesson as if nothing had changed. By the 10th loop, Marcus tried leaving the classroom. He walked into the hallway. Empty. Quiet. Other rooms were suspended in motion, students mid-laugh, mid-sentence, frozen in place like mannequins awaiting instruction. Only his classroom moved. He returned, and time restarted. By the 20th loop, the repetition was unbearable. He'd memorized every detail. The precise moment a pencil snapped, the cough from the front row, the chirp of a phone left on vibrate. Then he saw her, Jennifer, a quiet student who always sat near the windows. This time, she looked at him not with boredom or distraction, but fear. When he asked if she was all right, she hesitated. Why do I feel like we've done this before? Recognition sparked. They spent the next loop talking, just the two of them. She'd begun to remember, first fragments, then full loops. Somehow, they were the only two aware, trapped in the same recurring 50 minutes. Jennifer confessed she had been dreading that class. A major test was coming, and she hadn't studied. Anxiety consumed her attention. Marcus admitted he was anxious too. The principal was observing his next period, and he feared being judged. Both of them locked in fear of what came after. On the 27th loop, something shifted. Marcus stood in front of the class and said, "No test defines who you are. What you learn, how you think, how you question, that's what matters." He taught without pressure. Jennifer asked questions, real ones. The class felt less like a performance and more like a conversation. The bell rang, 11:05 a.m. Then 11:06. Time moved forward. After school, Jennifer found him in the hallway. "That really happened, didn't it?" she asked. He nodded. "We were both stuck." Jennifer smiled, tired but lighter. "I think we were trapped by our own fear. Once we let go of it, the loop let go of us." Marcus never forgot those 50 minutes repeated 27 times. They had taught him more than any curriculum could. Sometimes time doesn't trap us. Sometimes we trap ourselves, living the same hour over and over, paralyzed by what we fear is coming next. And sometimes the only way forward is to stop fearing the future long enough to be fully present in the now. The highway stretched ahead like it always did, 5 miles of smooth, unremarkable pavement between exit 47 and exit 52. James Patterson had driven this route hundreds of times. A veteran long-haul trucker, he knew every turn, every dip, every radio dead zone. But that night, something broke. It was 2:30 a.m. when he passed exit 47. The road was quiet, the world suspended in that eerie silence only night drivers know. His headlights carved a tunnel through the dark. Everything felt ordinary, until it didn't. He looked up expecting to see the sign for exit 52. Instead, exit 47 again. Same trees, same faded billboard, same peculiar dead tree on the right shoulder. The first time it happened, he thought he'd been mistaken. Maybe the sign was mislabeled. Maybe he was more tired than he realized. The second time, he knew better. By the 10th loop, panic set in. He tried speeding up, slowing down, taking a different lane, turning off his headlights and driving by the moonlight. But each time, after 5 miles, he found himself inexplicably back at the beginning. Exit 47. Again. He checked his GPS. It showed him traveling forward as expected. But his dash cam showed something else entirely. 43 identical stretches of the same 5-mile road, played back like film caught in a projector's teeth. The other vehicles on the road were worse. They moved strangely, jerky, flickering, inconsistent, as though they weren't fully real. A red sedan passed him, then was behind him again. A semi flickered into existence, then vanished, as if the world around him were a copy, glitching under its own weight. By Loop 30, James felt like a ghost in his own life. Then he noticed something new. A roadside memorial at mile marker 49. A small cross, plastic flowers, a faded photo of a man in a driver's uniform. He pulled over. It was for a trucker who had died at that very spot 15 years earlier. The name wasn't familiar, but the uniform looked just like his. James stood in the cool night air, heart pounding, surrounded by silence. He spoke aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to the night, to the past, to whatever might be listening. "I see you, you're not forgotten." There was no thunderclap, no gust of wind, just stillness. Then, as he returned to his cab and started driving, something felt different. The road stretched forward, smooth, real. Exit 52 appeared, not as an illusion, but as a promise kept. He pulled into a rest stop, hands shaking. The clock read 2:33 a.m. Only 3 minutes had passed since he first entered the loop, yet he had lived through hours of that same stretch of highway. The dash cam footage confirmed it. 43 identical segments, each 5 miles long. No explanation, No edits, no gaps in time. Just a repeating road in a world that had momentarily lost its place. James never experienced another loop. But he never drove that stretch of highway again without glancing at the roadside memorial, and wondering if some part of time had needed him to see it, to acknowledge a moment left unnoticed too long. Sometimes, he thought, maybe the dead don't want revenge. Maybe they just want to be remembered, and maybe time waits until we do. The smell of freshly ground coffee, the gentle hiss of steamed milk, the quiet hum of a city waking up. For Nicole Torres, it was just another morning shift at the coffee shop tucked into a corner of downtown Seattle. She'd opened the store hundreds of times before, unlock at 7 o'clock a.m., flip on the lights, start the brewers. A comforting rhythm. But this morning wasn't like the others. At 7:03 a.m., Tom, a regular, walked in and ordered his usual, large coffee, black. By 7:38 a.m., Nicole was carrying a tray of drinks to a table near the window when her foot hit a slick spot on the floor. The tray flipped, cups shattered, hot liquid splashed across the tiles. A collective gasp from the customers. Embarrassing. Dangerous. She spent the next 10 minutes cleaning up, heart pounding, cheeks flushed. Then she was back at 7 a.m. The lights were off. The machines reset. The door hadn't been unlocked. Same morning, same moment. Tom entered at 7:03 and ordered the same coffee. The second time through, Nicole still thought it might be stress, maybe a bad dream. But when 7:38 came, she slipped again, same tray, same spill. By the third iteration, she couldn't deny it. She was trapped. The loop held firm. Any changes she tried seemed swallowed by the same inevitability. Clean the floor? A different spill would appear. Ask others to carry their own drinks? A coworker would drop a tray at the exact same moment. The only thing that remained fixed was the disaster at 7:38. Nicole became obsessed. Why the spill? Why this moment? On the sixth loop, she noticed something she hadn't before. A young woman sitting by the window with a laptop open, completely absorbed in her work. Each loop she was there, typing, adjusting her glasses, sipping tea. Nicole began watching her more closely. On the seventh loop she saw it. The spill, if just a few inches farther, would have destroyed the laptop. She asked the woman what she was working on. "My thesis," the woman replied. "I'm backing it up right now. If anything happens to this file before I finish, I'm screwed." Nicole felt her chest tighten. On the eighth loop, she asked the woman to switch tables. No explanation, just a gentle request. The woman hesitated, then agreed. At 7:38 a.m., Nicole again began to slip, but this time she caught herself. The tray rocked, then steadied. No spill. She looked at the clock. 7:39. Time was moving forward. The loop had broken. The rest of her shift passed uneventfully. Customers came and went. Nothing repeated. Nothing reset. Days later, the young woman returned. She had completed her thesis and wanted to thank Nicole for encouraging her to move seats. "Someone spilled a drink exactly where I'd been sitting," she said. "I would have lost everything." Nicole smiled, saying only, "Glad it worked out." She never told anyone that she'd lived that moment 9 times to figure out what mattered. It wasn't the spill. It was what the spill threatened. Looking back, Nicole realized the loop wasn't random. It was a question in disguise. Would she see the person beyond the coffee orders, the quiet urgency behind the keystrokes? Time had waited until she did. And then it let her go. The intersection came into view just as it always did, quiet, empty, unremarkable. A 4-way crossing in the middle of a suburban route, surrounded by trees and glowing traffic lights. Alex Kumar, a software engineer finishing a long day at the office, was waiting at a red light. Music played softly in the background. The sky was turning violet with dusk. A pickup truck 2 cars ahead of him started to move. Then, from the cross street, a sedan ran the red light at high speed. The collision was devastating. The sedan slammed into the truck, which spun into a third car. Glass exploded across the pavement. Metal screamed. The chaos lasted seconds. 3 people died. Alex sat frozen behind the wheel, breath shallow, stomach clenched. He didn't even reach for his phone. He just stared. Then, he was back. 5 minutes earlier, the light ahead still red, the same song on the radio, the same cars in the same positions, and the truck about to drive into tragedy. Alex screamed. He honked, waved his arms, tried to warn the driver. It was no use. The sedan returned, unstoppable, indifferent. Again, the crash. Again, the deaths. By the 4th loop, he was outside his car, sprinting forward. Not fast enough. By the 7th, he tried driving into the intersection to block the way. He couldn't make it in time. Each repetition ended the same. 3 lives lost, time rewound, no one else aware. On the 11th loop, he succeeded in blocking part of the intersection. The pickup truck slowed, but the speeding sedan swerved and hit another vehicle instead. Still fatal. Alex realized then the loop wasn't trying to prevent the crash entirely. It was trying to prevent those 3 deaths. On the 14th loop, he understood what needed to be done. It wasn't about warning. It wasn't about changing who was at fault. It was about clearing the space. On the 15th loop, Alex pulled into the intersection at an angle that blocked every lane. No car could proceed. Horns blared, drivers shouted, chaos, but temporary. The sedan approached at full speed. Its driver, barely coherent, later confirmed to be intoxicated, slammed on the brakes. Tires shrieked. The car skidded, stopped just short of impact. Police arrived moments later. The driver was arrested. Alex received a citation for obstruction. He paid it without argument, because he knew. This time, time had moved forward. It was 7:43 p.m. The loop had broken. The 3 people who had died 14 times in his memory now drove away, unaware of what had almost happened, over and over and over. He never told anyone. The citation remained the only proof, and even that said nothing of the hours he'd lived reliving 5 unbearable minutes. But when he passed that intersection in the years that followed, he always slowed down, and he carried with him the weight of one impossible truth. Sometimes doing the right thing looks reckless. Sometimes saving lives requires being willing to disrupt the flow, to invite judgment, to endure misunderstanding. The world around him had kept moving, but Alex had changed. Time had demanded he see not just what was happening, but what could happen. And that was the moment it let him go. There is a strange quiet that settles over restaurants after closing time. The clatter of dishes fades. Voices fall to a murmur. Lights dim. The world contracts to a few tired employees, mops, and the scent of food that will soon disappear into trash bags. Maria Santos had managed her neighborhood bistro for 5 years. She knew the closing routine by heart. Lock the front door at 10 p.m. Count the register, oversee the cleanup, go home. Simple. Predictable. Until one night in 2018, when the routine betrayed her. At 11:30 p.m., after wiping down the counters and locking up, Maria stepped outside and found herself back at 10 p.m. in the restaurant kitchen. The same dishes needed washing. The same couple at table 7 ordered dessert at 10:05. The dishwasher jammed at 10:23. Everything unfolding exactly as it had before. Loop 1, then 2, then 5. She tried breaking the pattern, closed early, left the register uncounted, mopped before the rush. Nothing worked. Each time at 11:17 p.m., a knock sounded at the locked front door. A homeless man, thin and soft-spoken, asked if there were any leftovers. Each time she said the same words, "I'm sorry, we've already thrown the food away." He nodded politely and walked off into the night. It was the only part of the night that felt unscripted, the only element that didn't belong to the predictable cycle. By the 8th loop, Maria began to wonder if he was the key. She tried saving leftovers. But by the time he knocked, the food had already been trashed or cooled beyond safety standards. When she tried preparing a new plate just for him, he refused. "I don't take charity," he said, "not if it's made just for me." She offered it anyway. He walked away. By the 12th loop, Maria was out of ideas. The rules weren't logical. They weren't even fair. They were deeply human. Then, on the 13th loop, she found a different path. At 10 p.m., she ordered an employee meal for herself, a practice permitted by policy. She ate half of it, slowly, during the cleanup. She left the other half untouched, still warm, still clearly hers. When the knock came at 11:17, she opened the door and held out the box. "I ordered too much," she said. "I'm full. Would you like the rest?" He looked at her, saw the half-eaten meal, and nodded. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I hate wasting food." He took the box and sat on the curb outside, eating without haste. At 11:30, Maria locked the doors and stepped outside. This time, the air felt different. Time had moved forward. No reset. She walked to her car in silence, the city lights blinking like distant stars. Maria never spoke of the loop. There was no proof it had ever happened, no evidence left behind, only a shift inside her, like a knot that had quietly untangled. She realized then that some patterns don't break until we see the dignity in another person. That help isn't always about giving. It's about how we offer it. The loop hadn't been about food. It had been about respect. And time had waited. Not for charity, but for compassion that asked nothing in return. The university library hummed with quiet purpose. Lamps cast pools of yellow light across long wooden tables. Highlighters flicked, pages turned, and keyboards clicked softly beneath the pressure of looming finals. Jessica Park sat at her usual table, head bowed over organic chemistry notes, determined to push through the fog of exhaustion and anxiety. It was 8 p.m., and she had 90 minutes before the library closed. Plenty of time to cram, not enough to breathe. At 9:30, she packed her things and headed home. Then she was walking through the doors again. The clock read 8 p.m. Same table, same notes, same library buzz, as if the last hour and a half had never happened. The second time she thought it was stress. Maybe she dozed off. But the same sequence unfolded. The librarian passed at 8:22. A girl in a red sweater dropped her pen at 8:14. A group of students whispered and laughed at 8:45. At 9:30, the loop reset again. By the third iteration, Jessica was certain. She was stuck. She tried changing tables. The events repeated. She left the library early. She still returned at 8:00. Each loop held her in the same space, forcing her to relive those 90 minutes with no exit. On the 5th loop, something changed. She noticed the student sitting across from her, a young man with dark hair and tired eyes, glancing at her too often, as if expecting something. When their eyes met, he said quietly, "You're stuck too, aren't you?" His name was David. He'd noticed the loop on his third repetition. They compared notes. Every detail matched. Two people, trapped together in a night that refused to end. They tried to make sense of it. Were they being tested, punished, given time to study? Then Jessica realized something deeper. This table. They used to sit here together, sophomore year, before they broke up. It had ended badly. There were things unsaid, questions unanswered. Neither of them had ever reached out again. They'd avoided each other for 2 years on campus. Now, forced to share space again, they talked. Tentatively at first, then honestly, about the silence, the regrets, the immaturity, the pain they never acknowledged. They weren't seeking reconciliation, just understanding. On the 7th loop, they actually laughed, over how stubborn they had both been. The tension between them dissolved into something softer, a shared memory instead of an open wound. At 9:30 p.m., Jessica gathered her books, unsure if the loop would reset again. It didn't. The clock ticked to 9:33. Time had moved on. She and David walked out together, no longer avoiding eye contact. They didn't become best friends or lovers again. But they had spoken the truth. They had listened. And time, it seemed, had only been waiting for that. Later, Jessica would wonder how many moments in life loop quietly without our knowing. How many times we revisit the same emotional ground, the same argument, the same avoidance, without noticing we're trapped. Maybe, she thought, the universe gives us these second chances not to change the past, but to release its hold on us. And sometimes, all it takes to move forward is a conversation we were too afraid to have the first time around. September 15, 2020, was a Tuesday. Cloudy. Unremarkable. In Milbrook, a quiet town of 3,000 tucked between hills and farmland, it began like any other morning. People rose with the sun. Children walked to school. The bakery opened at 6 o'clock a.m., serving cinnamon rolls and black coffee. Life followed its usual invisible script, until it didn't. On September 16th, the editor of the local newspaper received a strange call. A woman claimed she'd lived through the 15th 3 times. The editor assumed she was confused, maybe an elderly caller with a memory issue. But then another call came, and another. By mid-afternoon, more than 30 residents had reported the same experience. The same Tuesday, lived more than once. Not déjà vu, not dreams. Full days repeated, minute for minute. A teacher had taught the same lesson 3 times to the same class. A mechanic had fixed the same car twice. A child remembered dropping her ice cream cone at exactly 10:47 a.m. on multiple versions of the same day. The reports were consistent. People who didn't know each other described identical events happening in exact detail across multiple repetitions. Some residents experienced 2 loops, others up to 9. Strangely, not everyone remembered. Many had no awareness of anything unusual, but those who did shared a common thread. Each loop ended only after they made a different choice. A woman said the loop ended after she finally called her estranged sister and apologized. A man claimed it broke when he gave money to a homeless person he'd passed by in silence twice before. And then there were the moments of recognition. Residents recalled locking eyes with strangers across a grocery aisle or street corner, sharing a quiet nod, as if both understood something no one else could see. We've lived this day before. The local journalist chronicled 87 testimonies. He tried to find patterns, science, sense. There were no fault lines nearby, no experiments being run, no cosmic events. Nothing to explain why a single town had been caught in a repeating day. In the end, there was no conclusion. The story was published, then dismissed. A curiosity, a likely hoax. Whispers of mass delusion, attention-seeking stress. But the residents knew. They knew what it felt like to live the same day with increasing urgency. To feel time holding its breath, waiting, to be granted, perhaps gifted, multiple chances to get something right. They returned to their routines. September 16th passed, then the 17th. Life continued. But something had changed. People smiled more, apologized more, paid attention. The loops, it seemed, had not only repeated time, they had restored awareness. A reminder that even ordinary days are built of fragile moments, that how we act in one morning can echo for lifetimes we may never fully see. No one could explain what happened. But in Milbrook, when someone drops a coffee or misses a bus, they sometimes glance around, half expecting someone else to nod in quiet recognition. And occasionally someone does. Because maybe the point was never to prove the loops existed. Maybe the point was to remember that our days, no matter how small, carry weight. And when given a second chance, it's not about doing something extraordinary. It's about doing the right thing when we didn't the first time. Time loops, if they exist, rarely announce themselves with grandeur. They come quietly, embedded in the mundane, the familiar. A spilled coffee, a forgotten necklace, a missed turn on a road you know by heart. For 10 individuals, and possibly an entire town, these repeating moments became more than coincidence. They became crucibles, not places of punishment, but spaces of pause, forcing action that otherwise might never come. A man relived his commute 19 times to save a girl he hadn't noticed. A doctor failed again and again before discovering a hidden wound. A bride wore the right necklace and finally stepped beyond the perfection she was afraid to leave behind. Others found themselves caught in loops centered not on survival, but connection. Conversations never had, compassion never shown, fear never confronted. These were not loops of spectacle. They were loops of meaning. And in each case, the repetition ended not with escape, but with a realization. That raises a question. What if loops are not aberrations, but corrections? What if time, on rare occasions, waits for a choice, a gesture, a moment of clarity that would otherwise be lost in the rush toward tomorrow? These stories suggest a pattern. The loops began with blindness, a missed detail, a dismissed person, an avoided truth, and they ended with attention, with presence, with the courage to see. But what of the rest of us? How often do we repeat moments without knowing? How many conversations are rehearsed versions of old scripts? How many days blur into each other because we never pause to ask, what is this moment trying to tell me? Perhaps we all live small loops, not temporal, but emotional, behavioral, spiritual, cycles of regret, repetition, and routine. We tell ourselves we've moved on, but we haven't. We revisit the same arguments, the same silences, the same missed opportunities. And maybe, just maybe, some of those déjà vu moments are echoes of repetitions we don't remember. These stories don't offer proof. They offer reflection. They are not invitations to believe in magic, but reminders that awareness itself is a kind of miracle. Because what they teach us, over and over, is that the smallest actions can shift the entire course of time. A cup not spilled, a stranger saved, a truth spoken, and in those shifts we are reminded, time may be linear, but meaning is not. Meaning loops, waits, demands to be seen. So the next time the day feels too familiar, too rehearsed, pause, look around. You might be living a second chance, disguised as a morning like any other. There is something inherently fragile about closing time. Shutters pulled down, lights dimmed. The final sweep of a broom across a floor that's seen 1,000 footsteps. It's a moment that quietly separates one day from the next, a pause between stories. In 2018, Maria Santos thought she was just ending another night at the restaurant she managed. The kitchen cleaned, registers counted, dishes drying in stacks. At 11:30 p.m., she locked the door and stepped out into the warm air of a sleeping city. Then she was back inside. 10 p.m. Same dirty counters, same lingering customers, same dishwasher malfunction at 10:23. The loop had reset. At first, she assumed it was a mistake, perhaps exhaustion, a daydream that had stretched too far. But the details repeated with surgical precision. Even the way the dishwasher groaned before jamming. Even the tired way her coworker laughed at a joke she'd already heard 3 times. Then came the knock. 11:17 p.m. every time. A homeless man at the front door, thin and quiet, asking if there was leftover food. Each time, Maria gave the same answer. "Sorry, we've already thrown it out." The restaurant had policies, health codes, rules, but the knock came again and again. By the 7th loop, she began to wonder, was the man the key? She tried holding back some food, setting it aside. He refused it. "It's not for me, if it was made just for me," he said. "I won't take pity." The 9th loop she tried again, prepared a fresh plate before closing. The man declined. "I still have my pride," he said gently. Maria began to see the loop differently. It wasn't about hunger. It was about how we see each other, how help is offered, and what it means to be seen with dignity. On the 13th loop, she tried something else. She ordered a staff meal for herself at 10:20 p.m. A right she rarely used. She ate half of it, then left the rest untouched in the break room. When the knock came at 11:17, she opened the door. "I couldn't finish my dinner," she said, holding out the box. "Would you like the rest?" He looked at her, then at the box. Not charity. Not leftovers scraped from a plate meant for someone else. Just a half-eaten meal. Real. Human. He nodded and took it. "Thank you," he said, and sat on the sidewalk to eat. At 11:30 p.m., Maria locked the door again. And this time, she didn't reset. Time moved on. She never saw him again. But the loop had left its mark, not as a scar, but as a quiet understanding. That the way we treat others, especially when no one is watching, can be the hinge on which entire days turn. Sometimes it's not about solving a problem. It's about offering something in a way that affirms someone's worth, not their need. And in that moment, Maria understood. Time had waited until she didn't just give, but gave with grace. Only then did it let her go. What if memory doesn't lie? It just forgets the parts we weren't ready to see. Across these 14 stories, one thread has quietly pulled its way through each narrative. Repetition, not as punishment, but as invitation. We began with a question. What happens when time stops obeying its own rules? Now we end with a deeper one. What does it take for time to begin again? Every person who lived through a loop faced a moment they were not fully present for the first time, a truth ignored, a stranger overlooked, a fear avoided. The loops forced awareness, and with it, choice. The commuter had to save a girl he hadn't noticed. The surgeon had to find the wound no scan could detect. A teacher had to speak honestly to a student afraid to fail. A manager had to feed a man in a way that honored his dignity. None of them escaped the force. No one rewound time through technology or desire. They were released only when they did something different, something truer. Not grand, just human. And this, perhaps, is the most haunting suggestion of all, that time doesn't simply move forward. It waits. It waits for us to act with intention, to see what we've refused to see, to forgive what we've held on to step out of the patterns we mistake for fate. Most of us live without loops, at least ones we remember. But what if loops are more common than we think? What if déjà vu isn't a glitch, but a trace memory of the attempt before? What if your second chance came and went, and you just don't remember the first? We'll never know how many people are stuck in repetitions they cannot name, how many gestures remain unfinished, how many conversations never started, how many kindnesses are still waiting to be offered. But what we do know is this: the universe, whether by accident or grace, sometimes gives us another turn. A loop of time, a flicker of recognition, a sense that something needs to change. And in that fragile moment, we are given a gift, not to rewrite history, but to rewrite ourselves. So the next time you feel that shiver of familiarity, that uncanny sense that you've lived a moment before, pause. Ask yourself, what is this moment asking of me? Because maybe the question isn't whether time is looping. Maybe the question is whether we are listening when it does, and whether we are ready to choose, at last, the thing we should have chosen all along. Not because time demands it, but because we do. This is how time moves forward, one choice at a time, one awareness at a time. One moment, finally seen, for what it really is, a chance.